12 soldiers vanished. No blood, no war cry, just folded uniforms. 12 soldiers vanished. No blood, no gunfire, no footprints leading away from their posts. Just their rifles, their radios, their dog tags and neatly folded uniforms resting silently where they once stood guard. The jungle didn't swallow them. The enemy didn't take them. They were simply gone. In the heart of Tay Ninh Province, South Vietnam, at a forgotten hill near the Cambodian border, there once stood a place the U.S. military refuses to speak of, Firebase Echo. Officially, it was decommissioned in March 1969 due to strategic repositioning. But the surviving men of Alpha Company tell a different story, one buried in sealed files denied by command and haunting those who lived it. What happened at Firebase Echo was not war. It was something far older, far stranger, and far more terrifying. Some say it was mass hallucination. Others suggest psychological warfare, but those theories unravel when you examine the details, the sightings, the voices, the disappearances. This isn't just a lost military base story. This is a tale of cursed land, of a place that never wanted to be occupied, and of soldiers who dared to ignore the warnings etched in folklore and whispered by the locals for generations. The hill where Firebase Echo was built had already claimed lives long before American boots ever touched it. French Foreign Legion troops vanished there in 1954 without a trace. Villagers refused to go near it, calling it Maquai spirit-haunted. Cambodian elders called it sacred burial ground protected by ancient entities that shift their form, twist your mind, and lead the living into the shadows. When the U.S. Army set up Firebase Echo in late 1968, they brought not just firepower but arrogance, the kind of arrogance that thinks wire fences and 105mm howitzers can protect you from something buried beneath centuries of blood. What followed over the next few months was a descent into the unexplainable phantom radio transmissions, mirror versions of soldiers walking inside the wire-vanishing gear, impossible terrain shifts, and eventually 12 men lost to whatever lives in that jungle. This isn't just Vietnam War horror. This is one of the most chilling classified supernatural files buried in U.S. military history. And to this day, the hill remains untouched, avoided even by locals, as if the ground itself remembers. In this episode of Whisper of War, we open the case of Firebase Echo, a haunted firebase where war met something far worse. Stay with us as we reveal why some positions aren't abandoned. They're rejected. They called it strategic ground, a low jungle hill overlooking a Saigon River tributary close enough to the Cambodian border to monitor enemy infiltration, but isolated enough to serve as a launch point for search and destroy patrols. To the Pentagon, it was just another pin on a map. To the soldiers deployed there, it was Firebase Echo. But long before any American boots touched that soil, that hill had a name among the locals. Not one they would write on maps, but one they would whisper only in warnings. The Vietnamese called it Jat Chet, Deadland. The Khmer had a darker phrase, the mouth of the forest. They believed the jungle was alive here, not in a poetic sense. Literally, that it watched, that it remembered, that it swallowed, and that it punished. French colonial records long buried in French army archives and only recently declassified describe an incident in early 1954, weeks before the fall of Dien Bien Phu, when an entire company of French Foreign Legionnaires was assigned to pacify the same hill. They vanished during a night patrol. No bodies, no gunfire, only scattered gear and an empty radio net. French officers blamed desertion. Survivors of that unit, those not on patrol that night, blamed something older. They spoke of a shifting spirit that wore familiar faces and led men away like a siren in the fog. Their reports were dismissed, their sanity questioned, and their names erased from any official citations. That pattern would repeat. It always does. You won't find Firebase Echo on any Vietnam War tourist maps. There are no battlefield tours, no plaques, no commemorative markers. Not because nothing happened there, but because what happened can't be explained in conventional terms. It violates everything the military believes about control protocol and reality. And perhaps more importantly, it forces the United States to confront the arrogance of occupying a place it never understood. When Alpha Company arrived in November 1968, They didn't know this history. Nobody briefed them on legends. Nobody warned them that the Kit Carson scouts, the South Vietnamese defectors now assisting U.S. units, refused to sleep within the wire. When asked why, one scout reportedly muttered, "Not your land, not your war." His words were ignored. And that's the tragic foundation of Firebase Echo, a fire support base built not on solid ground, but on forgotten blood, sacred burial mounds, and centuries of restless silence. The hill was littered with ancient grave markers, mostly overgrown stone piles that engineers bulldozed during construction. To command, they were just rocks. To the people of that land, they were the only boundary left between the living and something older. What the Americans didn't realize was that the jungle wasn't reacting. It was remembering. And soon, it would begin to respond. They laid down wire, mines, claymores. They cleared lines of fire, built bunkers, mapped patrol routes. They believed in their firepower, their discipline, their protocols. But those tools only work against enemies who follow the same rules. Echo's enemy did not. And no one, not even Captain Brennan, understood that the moment the first bulldozer ripped through the moss-covered stones, a transaction had begun. An occupation had started. But this time the land was not being occupied, it was waiting, and the price for trespass was already set. What's most disturbing is that so many of the early signs were dismissed as folklore, dismissed as local superstition, the same mistake repeated by every colonial army that ever set foot in Southeast Asia. But this wasn't some campfire ghost story. The soldiers of Alpha Company were stepping into a space that had rules older than radio signals and recon maps, and those rules didn't care about American uniforms or rank or fire superiority. This was a spiritual war, and they brought bullets to a battlefield ruled by memory, by ritual, by violation. And the moment they broke ground, the hill began watching. The sightings didn't start immediately, but the unease did. Men reporting strange dreams. The sound of voices in languages they couldn't identify. Equipment that didn't function in ways that made sense, not sabotage, just refusal. Refusal to work. Refusal to respond. Like the base itself didn't want to be alive. That eerie inertia would only intensify in the weeks ahead. But it's important to understand this wasn't just a haunted fire base. It was a provoked spirit, a desecrated place. And the presence they awakened wasn't defending territory, it was reclaiming it. This wasn't American land. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a mouth, and soon it would begin to feed. What comes next are the first cracks in logic, the moments where radio transmissions bleed into another era, where shadowy figures walk outside the wire, and where the jungle stops acting like jungle. It starts with one voice, one phrase on an open channel that doesn't belong to any living unit, a call sign that no one issued, a language that sounds almost French, almost, and it always comes after midnight, right when the hill is at its quietest and most awake. It began as most hauntings do, not with screams, but with whispers. 1 week after Firebase Echo was fully operational, the first documented anomaly occurred. November 22, 1968, Private First Class Lester Kowalik was pulling night radio watch inside the communications bunker. It was standard protocol monitor the emergency frequency between 2200 and 0400 hours. What wasn't standard, what has since become one of the most widely cited entries in Vietnam War paranormal reports, was what came through the static at exactly 02:17 a.m. Kowalik described it as not noise, not feedback, but language. A voice, speaking fluent Vietnamese but in a dialect none of the interpreters recognized. Mixed into it phrases in French, Old French, the kind taught in colonial academies, not heard on the battlefield since 1954. At first, command dismissed it as enemy psychological operations. Hanoi had used radio tricks before, but this was different. The voice wasn't taunting. It was transmitting reports, position updates, casualty numbers, coded messages delivered in perfect military cadence, but using call signs that didn't exist in any current U.S. system. And some of the terms extraction by fixed-wing red line Charlie priority gold casualty were long outdated, last used during World War II. More disturbing, the numbers being broadcast matched Echo's real-time status. On November 28th, when an Alpha Company patrol took 3 casualties during a jungle sweep, the unknown voice reported 3 down sector, Foxtrot 9er. Those words came through the radio exactly 11 minutes before the squad even returned to base to report it. No one had transmitted anything. No one had access to those numbers. But the jungle knew, and it was already speaking. These broadcasts continued sporadic, always at night, always when the fog rolled in thick enough to soak the radio antenna. Men started calling the frequency the grave net. Some refused to monitor it. Others grew obsessed. One night, specialist Quincy Washington swore he heard his own voice come through the speaker. "I'm pinned," it said, requesting extraction from Grid Bravo 19. But Quincy hadn't left the base, not even once. He threw his headset and refused to take night shifts after that. In post-war interviews, he broke down while recounting it. "It wasn't just my voice," he said. "It knew something I hadn't told anyone. Coordinates from a letter I never mailed. How no one had answers, only patterns. Patterns of repetition of the past, trying to reach forward and the present echoing back. And the jungle was the amplifier." By early December, the voices were joined by sightings. The first came from the Northwest Guard Post. 02:34 a.m., PFC Albert Rutowski, Detroit-born, raised in Polish Catholic tradition, not prone to hallucination, reported seeing a lone figure moving through the tree line. At first, he thought it was a friendly patrol returning from a long-range recon, but the posture was wrong. The gait too casual, no weapon, no tactical awareness. The figure walked upright, arms swinging like someone out for a stroll. Rutowski followed protocol. He issued a verbal challenge. No response. He launched a flare. In the burst of light, the tree line was empty. No rustling. No retreating footsteps. No noise. Just thick foliage and the fading hiss of the flare burning out. The next night it happened again. This time to Corporal Dillon in the South Sector. Then Sergeant McNamara. Then 3 more in different quadrants of the perimeter. All described the same, being one lone walker always appearing at 2 or 3 a.m. just far enough away to avoid detail, never responding to light or voice. What unsettled the men most wasn't the shape, but the consistency. It moved the same every time. Same posture, same path, same refusal to acknowledge its watchers. It wasn't scouting. It wasn't lost. It was rehearsed, as if acting out a loop. Or worse, waiting for a cue. The phenomenon was dubbed the Walker. Some began keeping logs trying to predict its path. Others refused to look at the tree line after midnight. Staff Sergeant Pulowski, normally hard-nosed and skeptical, admitted in his journal, "There's something about the way it moves, like it doesn't care we're here. Or maybe it doesn't see us, or maybe it does, and just doesn't care." Motif began to emerge. The same timing. The same direction, the same moment of vanishing when artificial light hit it directly, like it could only exist on the edge of human perception, and once challenged it retreated, or simply ceased. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was a pattern, a rhythm, a message played in loop. Meanwhile, strange smells began drifting through the fog. Medic Franklin Dubois noted in his logs sweet rot, old incense, like funeral flowers left too long in the sun. Electronics shorted randomly. Lighters wouldn't spark past midnight. The mess tent's lanterns dimmed without losing fuel. Patrol boots would be found damp despite no rainfall, and always the radio whispered at 2 a.m. The gravenet humming voices, old and lost, refusing to fade. These weren't isolated events. They were a rising tide, a slow tightening of unseen pressure, a warning perhaps, a test. And Firebase Echo, built on bones and defiance, was beginning to feel it. Still, command refused to act. Brennan wrote in his private journal, "They think it's nerves. I think it's notice. We're not wanted here. The land is watching." He was right, but he was also too late, because the jungle had already begun to change its approach, from voices to visions, from watchers to doubles. And the next thing to come wouldn't speak. It would mirror. On January 7, 1969, the jungle stopped whispering. It began reflecting. The first confirmed doppelganger encounter occurred just after 3:00 a.m. Private First Class Stanislaw Kovar, 20 years old, quiet a Chicago warehouse worker before the draft, was manning the eastern bunker when he spotted movement inside the perimeter. That alone was cause for alarm. No one was scheduled to be on that side. As the shape approached, Kovar prepared to issue a challenge, but something stopped him cold. It wasn't the uniform or the gear, it was the face. His own. Same helmet scuffed on the left rim, same patch of sweat-stained olive drab, same M16 with the taped grip, same face right down to the barely healed scar over his eyebrow from shrapnel 3 weeks earlier. Kovar froze. The figure didn't speak, didn't blink, just stared. Its eyes, he would later report, were like mannequin glass, reflective but dead, empty. The figure stood silently for a full minute, then turned and walked back toward the center of the base, vanishing behind a mound of earth near the communications bunker. Kovar followed, but found nothing. Not a footprint. Not a shadow. Nothing. That encounter marked a shift in Firebase Echo's timeline from passive observation to active mimicry. The jungle wasn't just echoing radio chatter or replaying old transmissions. It had started replicating the living. Within 2 weeks, 5 more soldiers reported seeing themselves or close versions. Some caught only a glimpse through fog. Others locked eyes. All of them said the same thing: the duplicates didn't flinch, didn't run, they just watched. And there was always one common thread: their eyes were wrong. No emotion, no depth, like a mirror with no glass. Staff Sergeant Thaddeus Tank Pulowski's report is perhaps the most disturbing. On January 18th, during a standard pre-dawn perimeter inspection, he spotted someone approaching on the trail. At first he relaxed, thinking it was Corporal Henley from 2nd Platoon. But as the figure came closer, Tank realized it wasn't Henley. It was him. Not just in uniform, in every detail. Same torn sleeve from last week's patrol. Same wristwatch stopped at 12:04. Same mud pattern on the boots. Even the same pack of cigarettes stuffed into his flak jacket. Pulowski stood frozen as the double stopped 6 feet away. They stared at each other. Then slowly, deliberately, the copy smiled. A twisted, joyless expression, and said, "You shouldn't be here, Tank. None of you should be here." It used his voice, but not his tone, not his humanity. Pulowski reached for his rifle. The copy didn't move. Then without a sound it turned and walked into the morning mist, evaporating before it reached the wire. Pulowski filed an official report. But like all Echo reports from this period, it was buried under fatigue-induced hallucination and logged without follow-up. Off the record, other soldiers began carrying mirrors, knives, religious medals. One man refused to sleep anywhere alone, fearing they'll take my place when I'm not looking. Another refused to speak out loud, after sunset, terrified his voice would be copied. Even Brennan began to unravel. His personal journal from this period includes the line, "I'm starting to doubt who I'm speaking to." We've had men return from patrols who left in 2s and came back as 3s. And no one notices until they're gone again. The men weren't scared of being killed anymore. They were scared of being duplicated, of being erased and replaced by something that walked like them, talked like them, but wasn't them. The jungle, it seemed, had learned to wear the masks of the living, not to communicate, but to infiltrate, to blur the lines between watcher and watched. And always the same motifs returned, the same distorted smiles, the same black, depthless eyes, the same moments of quiet just before gear malfunctioned or flares failed to ignite. Some soldiers even claimed to hear their own voice in the night, whispering things they never said. Specialist Tidwell, the unit mechanic, refused to speak for 3 days after allegedly hearing his own voice call out over the PA system. They left the door open. The door to what no one knows. Maybe to something underneath the firebase, something that was now moving upward. Because by late January, Firebase Echo itself was changing. The topography shifted, landmarks inverted. Trails no longer led to where they had the day before. One bunker would suddenly be on the wrong side of camp. The mess tent path now opened into ammunition storage. Time warped. Men reported missing hours. Broken watches all stopped at 2:47 a.m., exactly when the first double was seen. The firebase wasn't haunted. It was being rewritten. molded, like the jungle was reshaping reality to match its memory, or to erase theirs. The doubles were no longer just warnings. They were replacements. And if a soldier vanished, how would anyone even know if the thing left behind was wearing his skin? One man. Private Mendoza took to carving a small X into his hand every morning, convinced it would help him confirm he was real. 2 days later, the mark appeared on 2 other men, and neither remembered carving it. That was the last time Mendoza spoke. His final words, according to a witness, were, "It knows who I am now." Firebase Echo wasn't losing the war. It was being absorbed into a different battlefield, one where identity was not a weapon but a liability. And the jungle wasn't hunting them for territory. It was hunting them for faces. But the worst part wasn't what the men saw in the fog. It was what stared back when they dared to look into the mirror. And soon they would learn that not every double was content to walk away. Some would stay, some would replace, and some would invite others to follow. February 23, 1969. It was supposed to be a routine patrol, 6 men sent south of Firebase Echo to verify suspected Viet Cong movement along a trail near a destroyed village. Standard recon and force establish eyes, report back, avoid contact. Second Lieutenant Garland Thorne led the team. Alongside him were Sergeant Blackwood privates Kowalik, Kessler, Washington, and Rutowski. These were Echo's veterans, men who had already seen the shadows walking at night, men who had heard their own voices in the static. But nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to witness. According to after-action testimonies, the first phase of the patrol was uneventful. Jungle, thick visibility, low atmosphere, heavy with humidity and silence. They moved slow, careful, every sound amplified in the green. By 22:30 hours they reached their observation point, a bamboo grove positioned near a fork in the trail. They settled in, weapons ready, radios tuned. Then the jungle changed. First came the sound, subtle at first, voices, laughter, not muffled or distant but clear, like someone had turned the volume up on an old record player. Male voices, multiple, casual, conversational. Then the footsteps, dozens of them, marching, rhythmic, out of sync with the terrain. Torchlight emerged next, actual open flame torches, not flashlights. The patrol peered through night vision scopes and froze. A column of figures was walking the trail, slowly, calmly, smiling, and what they wore made no sense. Some were dressed in U.S. jungle fatigues, others in old French colonial uniforms, some in black VC pajamas. Others still wore gear that didn't belong to any known army. Long coats, metal helmets, bare feet. Some looked ancient. Others looked like people the patrol recognized. I saw myself, Sergeant Blackwood would later whisper during an interview. But not just me. I saw guys from the firebase, men I knew were asleep back at Echo, men I knew were dead. One of them looked like my brother, but he's in Michigan. The soldiers didn't move. They barely breathed. The procession passed by without acknowledging them. Some sang. Some muttered coordinates. One man was dragging a rusted bayonet along the jungle floor. Another was holding a field radio close to his ear and nodding as if listening to an order. Their eyes were all wrong. Glossy, empty, like they weren't walking with purpose but being pulled forward by a current. Kessler reported seeing a girl maybe 13 wearing a U.S. helmet too large for her head and holding dog tags in both hands. He couldn't explain why but said he felt like she was about to speak his name. Thorne tried calling Echo for confirmation. Static. Then a burst of feedback. Then silence. When he lifted the receiver again, he heard his own voice whisper, "They see you now." That's when the jungle closed in. The torches vanished. The voices stopped. The path behind them was gone. Trees seemed to shift. Roots rearranged. Landmarks reversed. The patrol attempted to return to base, but every path was wrong. They walked for hours, but Echo's beacon, normally visible from kilometers away, kept disappearing every time they looked up. They were walking in circles, but the ground was never the same. One path led to a pile of U.S. ammo crates sealed in red wax. Another to a clearing filled with dog tags hanging from vines like wind chimes. Rutowski stepped into a stream and pulled out a rifle, his rifle, though he was still holding his own. Washington. The radio man swore he saw Firebase Echo through the trees. He ran. When the others caught up, he was standing still, eyes wide. "It moved," he whispered. The whole base moved. It took them 6 hours to return to Echo, a distance that should have taken less than 30 minutes. When they arrived, the guards were in a panic, because according to every log, every radio transcript, and every watch, the patrol had never left. Thorne's name was still listed for the midnight shift. Kessler's bunk was still warm, and no one had seen them leave through the southern gate. But the strangest detail wasn't in the files. It was in the jungle. When the sun rose the next morning, Sergeant Blackwood returned to the bamboo grove to retrieve a dropped ammo pouch. What he found instead were footprints, hundreds of them, barefoot, booted, heavy, light, all converging on the exact spot where his team had lain hidden. And among them, 12 perfectly defined prints walking in single file barefoot toward Firebase Echo. Each one was an exact match to a man who had already died in previous patrols. The jungle hadn't just shown them something. It had sent something back with them. And whatever followed them out of that grove wasn't alone. The hill had started moving. The air was thicker. The fog never lifted. And worst of all, the jungle now knew their names. In the command bunker, Captain Brennan flipped through the daily logs. His hand paused. His eyes froze. On a page not yet typed, a new patrol was listed. The names Thorne, Blackwood, Washington, Rutowski, Kessler, Kowalik. Same time, same route, same mission. But the page was dated February 30th, a date that doesn't exist. Firebase Echo had crossed into something else. A different kind of battlefield. One where time-repeated faces blurred and reality started folding inward. What happened that night wasn't a warning. It was a signal. And the final phase was beginning. Because what disappears in the jungle doesn't always stay gone. Some things return, and the ones that do aren't the same. March 8, 1969. Firebase Echo was nearing collapse, not from enemy assault, but from something far more corrosive: reality itself. Radios no longer worked with consistency. Patrol routes shifted. Bunkers seemed to rearrange, and more than one man reported seeing himself twice in a single day. The jungle was no longer at the perimeter. It was inside the wire, but none of that compared to what happened at 200 hours when an entire fire team of 12 men vanished without a single scream, a single shot, or a single footprint left behind. 2nd Platoon's 3rd Squad had been assigned to the eastern perimeter for night watch, 12 men led by Sergeant Earl Brennan, cousin to the captain. They checked in at 0145, confirming all quiet. At 0200, they were still visible on the security cameras installed atop the ammo bunker, 12 heat signatures motionless steady. Then, at 0203, the footage glitches. Static floods the screen for 7 seconds. When the feed returns, every position is empty. No movement, no alert, no bodies, just silence. The camera pans left, nothing. It pans right, still nothing. But then something impossible. In each firing position, folded neatly placed with care, the missing men's uniforms. Boots aligned, jackets folded with precision, helmets on top, dog tags resting on the pile, rifles leaned gently against the sandbags. 12 silent displays like shrines, like offerings. The relief squad, upon arrival at 0400, stumbled into a scene more fitting a mausoleum than a military base. The weapons hadn't been fired, the claymores were intact, the Constantina wire hadn't been touched, no signs of breach. But every position where a man had once stood now held only his gear laid out with reverence, as if they'd been undressed by invisible hands. Medic Franklin Dubois was the first to speak aloud what others feared to admit. This wasn't desertion. This was removal. Captain Brennan ordered an immediate full-base lockdown. Patrols swept the jungle. No blood trails, no dragged bodies, no signs of struggle. Dogs refused to follow the scent trails. Aerial reconnaissance picked up nothing. Division command was notified. Reinforcements scrambled. Files marked priority black. Internal investigation teams arrived within 48 hours, but no evidence explained how 12 men could vanish in a fortified kill zone without triggering a single alarm. And then it got worse. The missing men's personal effects began reappearing one by one in places they had no business being. Kowalik's rosary beads were found inside a sealed MRE pouch. Washington's radio was discovered still turned on in the comms bunker, transmitting a repeating phrase in his own voice, "Echo, this is Black Tree. Repeat requesting immediate extraction from grid point, Cambodia. Grid point location, 30 kilometers across the border." Deep inside territory Echo never patrolled. Sergeant Pulowski found his missing squadmate's notebook in his own rucksack. But the writing wasn't in English. It wasn't in any known language, just loops, spirals, repeating glyphs like eyes drawn over and over again. 2 soldiers quit the same day. One tried to claw open his own chest. Another stood motionless at the helipad whispering, "We're all copies." None of us made it back. Captain Brennan tried to hold command, but by March 10th, official orders came through Firebase. Echo was to be evacuated and dismantled within 72 hours. Reason given strategic redeployment, but internally the language was colder. Echo was labeled structurally compromised by non-kinetic phenomena. That's not battlefield code. That's military intelligence shorthand for unexplainable hostile influence. Before the last chopper lifted, division headquarters received a final incident report from Captain Brennan. In it, he wrote, "I no longer believe these are hallucinations, nor sabotage, nor enemy action. I believe we've disturbed something that predates this war. Perhaps all wars. I recommend permanent abandonment of this site. No reoccupation, no investigation. Just silence." His final note scribbled at the bottom said, "Some battles are not meant to be won. Some ground doesn't want to be held." After Firebase Echo was erased from the maps, the men were scattered across other units. The story was buried, classified. Some were threatened with court-martial if they spoke. Others were quietly discharged. But rumors lingered, and those 12 men, they never came back. Their bodies were never recovered. Their names are still etched into Panel 27W of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial as missing in action. But no one talks about the folded uniforms, the perfectly placed rifles, the coordinates whispered from a voice that shouldn't exist. The jungle didn't just take them. It preserved the memory of them, then rewrote their absence as ritual, as if to say, they were never yours to command. But the jungle wasn't done, because what Echo witnessed was not an end, it was a threshold, a moment where the veil thinned and something older stepped through, and the last man to see it would come face to face with the question none of them dared ask. If 12 men disappeared, what exactly took their place? Firebase Echo was officially decommissioned on March 20th, 1969. The orders came down from Division HQ without ceremony. 3 days, total dismantling, no media coverage, no official statement, no formal recognition of the 12 missing men, just silence. The base was packed into helicopters and trucks. The communications tower collapsed by controlled demolition. The howitzers were flown out, the wire was left to rot, and Echo's last guard post, marked only by a rusted dog tag hammered into a tree, was swallowed by jungle within weeks. The hill returned to stillness, but not peace, because something had changed, something irreversible. Those who served at Firebase Echo were scattered across different companies, different provinces, even different countries. The intention was clear: separate the story before it could take root. Testimonies were ignored, reports redacted, and those who asked too many questions were quickly labeled combat unstable and cycled into psychiatric review. Captain Brennan was transferred to a rear logistics role until the end of his tour. He never led another combat unit. He died in 1987. In his private papers donated anonymously to a veterans archive in 2004, he wrote, "They say we held the perimeter. They say we kept the enemy at bay. But they never asked who the enemy was, or what kept walking the tree line at night. The U.S. military has never acknowledged Firebase Echo's disappearance. The base is absent from public maps. No after-action reports were ever released. Freedom of information requests in 1985 were denied for reasons of national security. The men who survived Echo didn't just carry trauma. They carried fragments of a reality that never fully returned with them. 47 out of the 134 survivors would eventually seek psychiatric treatment. None of their files mentioned doubles, or voices, or vanishing patrols. Just the standard clinical diagnoses: insomnia, combat fatigue, dissociative episodes. But what they experienced at Firebase Echo wasn't dissociation. It was exposure to a presence that didn't follow rules of engagement. A presence that didn't recognize uniforms or flags. A presence that didn't care about sides. It only cared about trespass. And when the war ended, the jungle didn't forget. In the early 1990s, a small group of veterans from Alpha Company returned to Vietnam as part of a civilian reconciliation trip. They visited old battlefields, memorials, former villages, and finally they returned to the hill. The spot where Firebase Echo once stood was quiet. No markers, no structures. But the shape of the land remained the familiar curve of the eastern ridge, the shallow incline where the bunkers used to be. Local villagers refused to go near it. When asked why, one simply replied, "Too many faces. They watch when no one's there." Rutowski, one of the returning vets, described seeing something that still makes no sense. Beneath layers of moss and vine, he found a section of bunker wall still intact, a rusted ration canteen, and 12 boot prints perfectly preserved in the mud, each facing outward as if still standing guard. But they weren't ours, he said. The tread didn't match any known pattern, and the size wasn't right. Another vet who asked to remain unnamed claimed he heard a radio crackle from somewhere deep in the brush. A male voice, whispering coordinates that led back to Firebase Echo. When he followed the sound, he found a single helmet, resting upright, dry, clean, as if placed there minutes before, and under it a folded uniform, still bearing the name tag Thorn. But Thorn was never found. None of them were. What remains of Firebase Echo now lies beneath layers of green covered not by time but by refusal. Refusal of history to accept what it cannot explain. Refusal of institutions to record what does not fit. And refusal of the land to forgive what was taken from it. In military terms, Firebase Echo was abandoned, but the truth runs deeper. Firebase Echo was rejected. Rejected by the terrain, by time, by the boundary between life and death. And those who went too far into that jungle, they didn't just vanish. They were rewritten, perhaps by something that walks in their shape, perhaps by something that remembers every intrusion, and perhaps even now when fog creeps low over old battlefield soil and radios hiss with static in places they shouldn't. They're still watching. The walkers, the doubles, the echoes. This wasn't just a haunted firebase, it was a warning, a message engraved in absence. Some land doesn't want to be held, some names aren't meant to be repeated, and some battles aren't about victory, they're about recognition. The men who served at Firebase Echo didn't lose a war, they stepped into one already in progress, fought on a different level, by rules we were never meant to learn. Their story was buried. But memory, true memory, never dies. It waits. In the trees. In the signal. In the place no one visits anymore. Thank you for joining Whisper of War for this classified chapter of Vietnam War horror. If you've ever heard of a patrol that walked into the trees and never came back, now you know why. Leave a comment below. Do you believe in military encounters with the paranormal? Or are some stories too dangerous to accept as truth? Either way, don't forget. Firebase Echo was never supposed to exist, but some ghosts still answer when you call, especially after midnight. Maybe the scariest part of Firebase Echo isn't the disappearing soldiers, the whispers in dead languages, or the doubles with empty eyes. Maybe it's the realization that there are places on this earth that reject human presence not with bullets, but with silence. That some wars aren't meant to be won. They're meant to remind us you are not in control. And maybe that's the real terror. Not what we saw, but what we woke up. Not what we lost, but what we replaced. If you've ever felt there was something wrong with a place, an abandoned house, a stretch of forest, a hill that feels off, you're not alone. Stories like Firebase Echo remind us that the world is still deeper, stranger, and older than any war or flag or map. And sometimes, it remembers better than we do. If this story left you unsettled, curious, or with more questions than answers, drop a comment. We read every theory. Save this video, because it's one of the few surviving records of a place that was meant to be forgotten. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe. The archives of war are deep, and not everything inside them stays buried. Until next time, listen closely. Some echoes don't fade, they wait.